Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my lecture on the Age of Discoveries, from the end of the Roman Empire to the Renaissance. Now, this lecture will cover an extensive period of time in which a lot happened, and the world as we knew it during the classic time came to an end and was replaced by an entirely different way of thinking, which was vital for the development of technologies that we still use today. It is also a time period that is quite difficult to pin down. More often than not, a time period is slowly fading out and another one is slowly coming in. Very rarely is there one moment that can be singled out as the end of one thinking and the beginning of another. Often it's singular events, but it takes a lot of time till the self-understanding of people living during that time do actually follow up and reflect the new reality. The end of the Roman Empire is also one of those difficult events. Well, the year 476 after Christ offers itself as a good point of departure when Odoacer ousted the last Roman emperor. But when does the medieval time, this 1,000 years of in-between, come to an end? Some argue in technological terms and say with the beginning of the widespread use of black powder, which leads to the demise of the knight as a central figure in medieval societies. Others argue it has more to do with the way of thinking, with the beginning of humanism and the rise of focus back on, or focus exclusively on, the human nature as the source of development. Others say it has something to do with the geographical horizons. Ends in 1492, when we focus away from the Mediterranean Sea and see the world as a whole, with the discovery of America. It's not simple, as you can see. Now let's get started. The importance or the dramatic event of the demise of the Roman Empire could probably be best understood if one is aware of the dimension of this construct, this Roman Empire, stretching from the Britain, from England down to Morocco, to Egypt, Armenia, that had all been part and conglomerated in the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire had different forms of manifestation, so to say. In certain areas, the Romans introduced military law, which means they had their legions placed in a territory. They might have placed the province under direct control, or they would have allowed the puppet king to be in place. In other areas, they would establish civil law, or That means that the whole administration was very much Romanized. The Roman law came into place, but also Latin as the administrative language was introduced. Today, in those countries that trace their language back to Rome, to Latin, be it Italy, Spain, French, these are all countries where Rome introduced their civil law. Countries under the military government, like Germany, Germania Inferior, for example, they remain with their traditional language most of the time. Being Roman was also very fashionable. It was very chic, and I myself was excavating an excavation site of Celtic Britain, a settlement of Celtic Britons after the Romans conquered a part of the island, and you could see how their architectures, the luxury goods started to resemble Roman way of life. The Romans introduced a series of technical novelties that allowed the expansion of the empire and led to serious improvements of the quality of life of its citizens. Around the year 200 before Christ, the Romans introduced cement as a very durable, very practical building material. The cement was used really earlier, but the Romans strengthened it further with potash that they were mining close to Naples in the area of Vesuvio. And this high quality cement that they had at their hands was used for massive infrastructure projects. Here, for example, bridges over major rivers, some of which last to this very day. But also aqueducts, so waterways, marvels of Roman engineering, made sure that cities, they were rising in number, and the number of inhabitants had supply of water, of fresh water, from sources nearby. Some of those aqueducts had actually different lines of water stream, so fresh water coming in, sewage water going out. With the introduction of cement, it became also possible to lift the scale of buildings. Arches, vaults and dome were spreading throughout the empire, becoming bigger and bigger. The ability to build more daring, the architecture is developing greatly around that time. One of the most noticeable innovations that the Romans introduced was their grid of trade routes throughout the empire. These streets or vias were used, as said, for trade, but of course also to move armies fast. These roads were built with different types of gravel, had a fine sand layer, and then flat paving stones on top. This assured on one hand that no matter how much rain or snow would fall on the roads, it would keep its shape and form. And on the other hand, the flat surface allowed for a smooth transportation of goods on chariots, and also an easy marching for their armies. These roads on one hand assured, for example, the supply of goods for the fast-growing cities, Rome also, but it also meant that ideas could spread very far. That included the religion of the legion, Christianity. In the year 313, Constantine legalized the worshipping of under Christian beliefs, and in 380, Theodosius makes Christianity the official religion of the empire. These roads were most of the time straight, because the Romans didn't have to take much care for different property rights, and even if there were hills ahead up the mountain, the Romans built quite straight. Curves were not really their thing. Every 10 miles there was a post house where fresh horses were waiting to be changed, and all 25 miles were inns, lodging opportunities to rest and to stay overnight. As you can see on those examples out of Greece, these Roman roads were very durable, and some of them are still in very good condition to this day. Also, the dimensions the Romans engineers used are still influential today, because the streets were exactly as wide as it was necessary for two chariots to pass each other, and the same dimension was then used for modern railway tracks. Not only did the Romans establish a system of travel roads with their new building materials that they introduced, they also were able to build very luxurious compartments, like cutting thin marble and using them as a cover of the outside and inside walls, very well often used for public baths or other public buildings. Now this chart here shows quite nicely how and from which direction the Roman Empire actually came under pressure. On one hand, we had a series of climate changes that forced the people of the north, German tribes, to abandon their traditional homelands and to move south. But on the other hand, the Huns, people of Mongol origin, started to move westwards and put pressure on a whole series of people, and they fled towards the Roman Empire. On the northern side, you see also that some of those people actually flee on the North Sea from what is now Denmark or Germany, Angles and Saxons, and resettle in to the British Islands, whilst Scandinavian people like the Goths pushed southwards and split between the East Goths and the West Goths or Visigoths that both actually will sack Rome. The very rich provinces of Africa, of northern Africa, have been at this time captured by another tribe, the Vandals. They try their very best to succeed in the Roman traditions, but as the Visigoths, none of them actually managed to establish lasting empires. Instead, they create a power vacuum, a weakness that will later be used by other forces to infiltrate these areas. With the demise of Rome in 476, for a lot of people that meant that the end of civilization has arrived. And this actually was echoed by long-standing beliefs, particularly in the early medieval time. There's a so-called four realm or four empire theory around that said that there are four empires that rule on this earth. One is the Babylonian kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, followed by the Persians. They were succeeded by the empire of Alexander the Great, and then the Romans. But the empire of Rome was seen as this pinnacle of social development, and thereafter could only come Judgment Day and the end of the world as we know it. So particularly at the beginning of the early times after the end of the Roman Empire, the common belief is that the end of the world is near and it's about to prepare for the time when the Messiah comes back and the world as we know comes to an end. This is also a reason for these extreme religious beliefs that took place or that started to get hold all over Europe. Not only did the legal security disappear, but also education and skills. It took us hundreds of years to recover the abilities to build similar buildings as was done in the high time of Rome. Also, a lot of the common shared knowledge is lost. Plato, for example, has almost disappeared and only rediscovered centuries later. So the dimension of the fall of Rome is really hard to understand and can barely be overestimated. Many of those military leaders that managed to establish law and order and to defend the population of the province later would be worshipped as saints. A very good example of that is, as you can see here, Saint George, most likely a Roman military leader, always depicted in fighting and killing the dragon, which is an old Christian symbol for the pagans, invading pagans. Here, of course, the picture is from high medieval times, probably 13th century. As you can see, the armament and the weapon doesn't point towards Roman equipment, but definitely later time. If King Arthur really lived or not, we probably will never know. There have been archaeological evidence of a warrior called Arthaud, where inscriptions were found. The castle longest been associated with him is Tintagel in Cornwall, although the castle itself has been built clearly at a later stage. Could very well have been an example of remembering the good old time and giving weight to one's own action by building a history, as we have seen so often. After the fall of the Roman Empire, it took over 300 years for a new central power to be established. On Christmas Day of the year 800, the new leader of Europe, Charlemagne, becomes emperor, enthroned and blessed by the Pope and accepted as the new Lord Protector over Christianity, which would subsequently be what the title Emperor would mean. He managed to unite large parts of Central Europe in bloody and gruesome wars, but the newly generated unity of Europe, the word becomes fashionable around his time, is again constantly under threat, mainly by two formidable forces. One, as you can see here in this map, are the Normans, putting pressure from the north and causing havoc on various metropolises on the coastal sites of Europe, going as far as Byzance. This pressure, though, becomes incorporated. The leaders of the Normans become the Dukes of Normandy and accept the overlord, the King of France. Another more difficult force to deal with are the expanding Islamic armies, putting pressure from the West. When we look at the expansion of the Islamic world at the time, the world looks very different. Whilst Europe, here in blue, is trying to consolidate power and is torn apart between civil wars. In the year 622, the Islamic world, or Muhammad establishes the latest update of the Abrahamite religions and triggers an enormously successful spread of this way of thinking and of his religion throughout all over the known world by that time. You can see here in dark red, this is the territories where Islam starts to spread, and given the very shaky fundamentals and the very superficial nation building processes not established by that time, it was quite easy for the advancing Islamic armies to establish control over these former Roman Empire territories. In the year 711, they cross the Strait of Gibraltar and move into Spain, and from there they are in direct contact with the Kingdom of the Franks. They lead military campaigns as far as today's Switzerland, but don't manage to establish lasting control over these territories. However, the Islamic armies now stand at the border and are a constant threat. They are even a greater threat on as their navy patrols the Mediterranean Sea. So while Europe is struggling, the Islamic world goes through what is called the golden age of Islam, a time when culture, but also knowledge and science, observations, but also poetry reaches new heights. During the Abbasids, their center is moved to Baghdad, and Baghdad now becomes the center of the civilized world. In Baghdad, a new institution is established, the House of Wisdom. The House of Wisdom unites the finest thinkers, philosophers and scientists of the Islamic world, but also, and maybe this is their most prominent contribution, they collect the existing knowledge and translate it into Arabic, Greek philosophy, but also Iranian writings. Writings from India is preserved and kept. A lot of that was also stored at the Library of Alexandria or at the Imperial Library of Byzantium, but due to the military actions, a lot of these writings are lost. Due to the House of Wisdom, a lot of these knowledge and wisdom is actually preserved and still available to our time. Among those rank, for example, the Kitab al-Hayawan, the book of animals, in which for the first time something like a struggle for existence is defined that bears resemblance to the later theory of evolution. But also algebra is developed there and spreads from Baghdad throughout Europe. What is very well known, even in our geographic regions, are the collection of fairy tales and stories. For example, the story of 1001 Nights, a whole collection of fairy tales survived and reaches us mainly through the House of Wisdom. And then the story of 1001 Nights goes that Shahryar, king, caliph, learns from the infidelity of the wife of his brother and has his own wife killed because gets jealous and decides all women are the same, and ever since he goes into a very or practices a very cruel procedure that he gets married to a virgin, the next day have her killed. When there were no more virgins found, the daughter of the vizier Sherenasad volunteers, and her strategy is that she tells the caliph a story and wouldn't give away the end of the story until next day came. Not the caliph being super excited to hear how the story continues. He would leave her alive, and she continues doing that for over 1,000 nights. After these 1,000 nights, that translates into more than 3 years, the Caliph agrees that she is different and stops his cruel behavior. Now, among those stories of those that she tells him over those 1,000 nights are very famous ones, like Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, for example, but also the mystical journeys of Sinbad the seafarer that shows us about the trade relations that the Arabic Islamic world had in the 8th and 9th century. These are glorious reports of the merchants' activities around that time. One of the most prominent figures that emerged out of the House of Wisdom and of the Golden Age of Islam, centering around Baghdad, is Avicenna or Ibn Sina. Born 980 and died in the year 1037, he's been seen as the founder of modern medicine. He came from Persia and is the author of the Book of Healing on one hand and the Canon of Medicine. And while the Canon of Medicine is basically a textbook of modern medicine and has actually been in use up to the 17th century and was even reproduced in 1960s, the Book of Healing is a philosophical approach to the power and balance of human existence. Very interesting read, and Ibn Sina has also been the central figure of a recent movie in 2013, The Physician, by Noah Gordon. Another superstar of the Golden Age of Islam is Ibn Rushd, better known as Averroes in its Latinized form. Here, this picture here is the School of Athens, painted by Raphael, and he even made it into this group of selected philosophers. You see him too in the mid left. Here, this is him in this picture. Now, Ibn Rushd was probably understood Aristotle better than anyone else. He made intensive comments. So he published intensive comments to Aristotle's writing, and Thomas Aquinas, for example, referred to Ibn Rushd only as the commentator of Aristotle. Very well respected, an excellent philosopher. Ibn Rushd was fighting against the Ash'ari theologians led by a certain Al-Ghazali. Now, for Al-Ghazali, it was clear that every natural phenomenon appeared because God wanted it to be in every instance. For Al-Ghazali, there was everything had a much more connection to the spiritual. There was a clear divide between the physical and the spiritual, much in line with Plato's thinking, while Ibn Rushd believed in a natural law on which everything followed. Very much the thinking of Aristotle. Al-Ghazali considered Aristotle, particularly as presented in Avicenna's writing, as contradictory to Islam. In the Islamic world, Ibn Rushd lost the battle. and the focus shifted to a more Platonic understanding of a constant interference of God in line with Al-Ghazali's understanding. In the Western world, with many up and downs, but ultimately Aristotle's approach won and paved the way for the success of science and ultimately technology as we have seen it. Besides the philosophical developments that were connected to the House of Wisdom, there's also clear innovations that are attributable to the House of Wisdom. For example, the developments around paper. Now, paper appeared around 200 before Christ in China already and slowly moved eastwards, westwards. But particularly due to the enormous demand in the House of Wisdom, in Islamic culture, there's the making and refining of paper was revitalized and made great advances. Among the many scientific discoveries and developments that are attributable to the Golden Age of Islam, there are also a number of technological innovations that are groundbreaking by that time. One of which is the use of water mills. Now, water mills at the time were not new, but the Islamic engineers turned them into much stronger, much more powerful devices and actually used them for production, not only of mills or in paper mills, but also for wood cutting purposes on an industrial scale. This would only be matched with the steam engine of the Industrial Revolution. The House of Wisdom and the Golden Age of Islam is coming violently to an end with the expansion of the Mongol. The second Mongol invasion after the first one to the Huns reached Europe in the 13th century and brings most civil cultural life to a sudden end. The area of Moscow is hard hit, Kiev completely destroyed. They move as far as Hungary and Austria and then ultimately return in 1942, elect a new Khan. Only in the 14th century do military technology of the European powers start to close up with the advances and advantages of the Mongol armies, and the Mongols get defeated on a number of occasions and ultimately establish the Khanate of the Golden Horde on the Crimean Islands, but also that they cannot hold. In 1258, the Mongols besiege Baghdad, conquer Baghdad, and cause enormous terror among the population. It comes to mass killings and the complete destruction of the collected wisdom and books that they had. They all threw these books for which they had no appreciation into the river Tigris. Eyewitnesses said that one could cross over the river Tigris by foot on the mountain of paper that was thrown in by that time. As we discussed before, during the Golden Age of Islam, Europe, Central Europe, was under pressure on one hand through the Viking invasions, but then also through the emerging, advancing armies of Islam. Once their immediate advances in the south of France had been stopped, there was of course, better known military endeavor, which led both Christian and Islamic armies against each other, namely the time of the Crusades. The time of the Crusades is a very interesting time. I cover here the time 1089 until 1192, which covers the first 3 Crusades. Depending on how you count and where you're from, you can go up to 9 or to 12 Crusades, but those are the classical Crusades. There are a lot of let's say, a lot of ideology has been woven into the story of Crusades. Yes, there were definitely a clash of ideology, but equally a fight for economic dominance. It had a lot to do with the right to send pilgrims to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, and this was a very lucrative business. The Pope Urban II gives his famous speech in Clermont-Ferrand in the year 1089, in which he claims the Knights of the Christian world to unite and to reconquer Jerusalem for Christianity. Beforehand, the Emir of Mosul actually blocked that old Belgium route for Christian Belgians from Europe. The real reasons for all of that is unclear, but so what was the idea was that if you fight free the way to Jerusalem again for Christianity, all your sins will be forgiven. Now, heavy drinking, constant fighting, nights of that sort could do with this forgiving, definitely, but also there were a lot of riches to be amassed along the way. And so that endeavor was very popular, very much in the line of thinking is high medieval times, so a knight of standing gets his glory from fighting as many enemies as possible. So here we go. We have 3 crusades, particularly the second crusades were then been driven by some fanatics, also from the Christian side, with Bernhard von Clairvaux. But in the 4th crusade, we see the getting together of some very wise men, most importantly Frederick II, a king being raised as cosmopolitan as possible by that time. And in those crusades we see a fruitful engagement on both sides. Besides the atrocities of war, ideas are exchanged and new fruitful impetus arrive on both sides. One of the technological innovations that the medieval time receives from the Arabic world is in architecture. What you see here is a classic Roman arch, which is symmetric and round, but can only bear a certain amount of weight. With the Christian architects bring back from the Crusades the Gothic arch, which is pointed, and this allows a very different structure because you have your weight pushing outwards, and the outward thrust is basically fenced off by a flying buttress. And this logic is much used by the medieval cathedrals. And also the medieval cathedrals built on the logic of, on the dynamics of a pointed arch that comes through the connection with the Islamic, through the touching point to the Islamic world. Here you see another blueprint of how these arches build in each other. Without this idea, these cathedrals of the medieval time, still standing and one of the most magnificent buildings of humankind, would not have been possible. With the establishment of universities, dedicated institutions towards science, a shift in thinking has been started that could not be turned back again. The medieval belief of man's role as being part of God's master plan that is about to come to an end, awaiting Judgment Day, has been replaced, or is in the process of being replaced. Now, man starts to seek wisdom and knowledge again, and tries to understand the world in which humans act, and try to understand which role humans have in God's creation. The universities, but also the rise of professions like the architects who built in the medieval cathedrals, the publicly acting intellectuals that now study the ancient philosophers again and participate in public life will dominate the cultural developments onwards. The path is set for what would later be called the beginning of the Renaissance.